going to be showing you today how to start a worm composting bin, as well as taking out the worm castings once it is complete. So you're going to need some sort of soil or compost bedding, I shouldn't say compost bedding, worm bedding for the worms. I like to use coconut coir. You can usually get it pretty reasonable. Organic coconut coir, usually about 10 to 15 bucks for one block of it. Is 11 pounds, and then you'll want to reconstitute it. So you take it and then you'll pour hot or warm water on it and let it sit, and then it will reconstitute into quite a bit. It'll expand a lot. You can also use compost that you already have out in the yard, or dirt, and actually I recommend using a little bit of dirt even if you're using the coconut coir. I like to kind of inoculate it with some of my compost or soil from out in my yard. You're also going to need some newspaper. I usually shred it in a shredder, and you can use that as well in with the soil that you have, as well as the coconut coir or other soil you're adding. You're also going to need some sort of tub. I just had an extra Sterilite or Rubbermaid container laying around with a lid. You want to make sure you have a lid for it. Some people drill holes up at the top, either in the lid or around the edge. I didn't do that. Every once in a while, when I noticed that the mixture started to get too moist, I would just crack the lid or take the lid off. By that time, the worms have been established and they really don't try to escape. When you're first starting your worms, you are going to probably want to leave the lid on it. I even left the lid off and put a light on it constantly for the first first week. They don't like to come out into the light, so that was a tip that I had found out, and it helped a lot to keep the worms in, because sometimes even if you put the lid on, they'll try to get out the cracks of the lid. I also would put some newspaper, sheets of newspaper over the top of it, and that kind of gives them safety and they stay under the newspaper. Occasionally you will get a rogue worm that will come out, but I most of the time actually had it in my guest bedroom, and I had really no problems at all after the first couple of weeks. And then of course you are going to need worms. I had started out with ordering worms online from a reputable business. I think it was called the Worm Brothers. I can't remember exactly the name. And it was a mixture of red worms, red wigglers, along with a few like compost or earthworms. You don't want to use just straight earthworms. They don't process as quickly as the red worms do. The red wigglers are actually super voracious and they'll eat through really quickly. So basically I'm just going to be adding what I sifted, the worms I had. You can see here that I had sifted, and there's quite a few worms still in this, as well as still some compost leaves and things that I had added. So I will just add the worms that I had sifted out previously. But like I said, you can get worms online pretty cheap. They're not super expensive. I think I got mine for between, I don't remember, it was $30 to $50. I don't remember the exact price for like a pound of them. You're really only going to want a pound, maybe two at the most, for a container this size. And there's a little bit of a misnomer that they're going to eat every bit of compost scraps that you have. You actually, at first, you're going to go very slow and only give them a little bit, just kind of like a handful to start to get them used to it once they're out of their bag. Mine are pretty used to eating, and even though I've disturbed them, they're probably going to not eat as well as they have been in the past. But I was working up to about a pound per pound of scrap per week for them. I even kind of kept it a little under that. I didn't do the full amount just because I didn't want them to multiply as much, because I really didn't want any other containers other than this one. But if you're wanting to expand and have more than one container, you can feed them a little bit more, and then they will procreate or expand the colony quicker. And when the worm compost bin is complete, you'll have everything mixed together in here. So I'm using coconut coir, worms, some soil, there's some leaves in here, as well as the shredded newspaper. And then I will cover it with newspaper on top, and I will get that damp. Usually, I usually use the coconut coir right after it's been reconstituted, so it's pretty damp. If you're at all thinking it's a little bit dry, you would need to be at least damp to the hand, not soaking wet, but you do need some moisture in here. Otherwise, if it gets too dry or too wet, the worms will want to try to escape. So you're going to want to go ahead and just kind of get that in between dampness to keep them happy in there. Then what I do whenever I'm going to feed them scraps, like I said, about once a week, I will dig down on one side, dump in the waste, the whatever it is, the scraps from the kitchen, and then cover it back up. I usually keep it, like I said, on one side or the other, and then I move it over to the other side the next week, and then they kind of move back and forth between the bin. It also helps when you're going to be harvesting the worm castings to have them on one side or the other. And I will talk about harvesting the worm castings after this video. Today's visitors are chipmunk, and some greckles. Cleaning out the worm bins. So I'm taking the worm bins that I had, the worms, excuse me, that I had in the containers that I've been feeding all winter, and I'm going to sift them out. I actually use this wire hand basket. You could use any kind of wire or any way to sift them out from the worm castings. I did feed them about a week ago, so hopefully they'll be on one side. I usually feed them on one side or the other, and then they gravitate mostly over to that area. So hopefully that will make it a little bit easier, but I still sift the whole thing just so I don't miss too many of the worms. It's not really going to hurt too much if you miss a few. So you will still have to pick through the new worm castings just to try and get any of the bigger worms, unless you have something that can really strain out the worms. Or you can just lose those worms, but I would rather save as much of the worms that I can, so I'm just sorting through and pulling out any of the big ones that I'm seeing. There will be a lot of smaller baby ones that you won't be able to see and pull out from the compost, the new worm castings. Once you've sorted all of the worm castings from the worms, or most of the worms, there's still going to be an occasional one that slips through, but this is what you have. It's super lightweight, very crumbly. You can push it together kind of in a ball, but it doesn't stick really well. It's just an amazing addition to, you can do it in house plants or out in your garden. Like I said, I like to make a worm casting compost tea, and I do have another video showing how to do that. But it's just super nutrient dense and a good way to use food scraps.